really much, you know, when people hear this, they immediately think politics. They immediately think, people with an axe to grind in one way or another. Let me reaffirm what Norm said. I'm here as a historian. I have no political axe to grind on this question. I don't necessarily have any religious agenda or anything like that. I come at this as a historian, and as a historian, I think I just come at this question in a way that nobody else does. And because usually when you think about this question, was America founded as a Christian nation? It's normally, you know, someone on the left or someone on the right saying yes or no, and they're using the past, they're using the history of the founding, the American founding, to try to prove some point in the present. So if you believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, or at least those people who do in our society today, what they tend to do is they tend to go into the past and they tend to find something there that's useful. We all want to find a past that's useful. So, hey, here's John Adams mentioning something about God or Christianity. That's useful to me. Here's John Adams, though, saying that he rejects the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Right? We're not going to put that in our book because that doesn't help us fulfill our present-day agenda. Same thing if you don't believe that America is founded as a Christian nation. You might focus on the fact that Thomas Jefferson wrote a Bible in which he cut all the supernatural parts out of the Gospels. If you on the other side, you might say, well, Jefferson believed in God. So what I try to do is, the best I can, at least, and you can't be perfect on this, but the best I can, I don't really care about the political ramifications of the question. I want to go into the past as a historian, look at the past in all its fullness and complexity. The past is very, very messy at times. It doesn't fit into our sort of present-day categories. So I'm trying to go into the past and do the best I can to try to say, well, what did the founders believe about the relationship between religion and the American Revolution? And as Norm mentioned, John Murren actually gives a nice blurb on the back of the book there. As John Murren mentions, you can't understand the American Revolution without understanding, to some extent, religion. Now, that's not to say the American Revolution was all about religion, but religion did play an important part in it. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. So in some ways, the title of the book is a little misleading because it makes it sound like I'm going to answer that question yes or no, and thus I'll immediately be polarizing, depending on what your position is. And when I do radio interviews on this, that's usually the first thing that the host on the radio station asks me. Well, what's the answer? That's the title of your book. And I say, well, I don't give an answer. It's a historical primer. It's an introduction that sort of lays out the details. And hopefully when you read it, you'll make the decision for yourself. You'll say, okay, there's a lot of evidence on this side or on that side. So let me tell you a few things about, again, what I've concluded about the relationship between religion and the American Revolution. The first thing I think we need to be careful about when we think about that title of the book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, is how are we defining those terms? So often this is debated, this question, in sort of 2-minute sound bites on news television, cable news. You got one guy who says no, one guy who says yes. They got 2 minutes to yell at each other, and you don't really get anywhere in terms of the actual historical context. So how do you define those terms? For example, when you say America is a Christian nation, right? What do you mean by that? What did that mean in the 18th century? Does it mean that somehow the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, were Christian in nature? Does it mean that the majority of people living in America were Christian, thus making it a Christian nation? Or something else? Does the nation act in a Christian way? Which then raises the question, someone asked me this recently, can a Christian nation uphold the institution of slavery, for example? Are those two contradictory terms, Christian nation and slavery? How do you define nation? When was America founded? Well, if you were to say, I was just talking to Norm about this before, if you were to say that America was founded when the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower in 1620, then you would have to say, well, yeah, the Pilgrims were trying to, like it or not, the Pilgrims were trying to create a distinctly Christian society there in Plymouth Colony. So were the Puritans who came to Massachusetts Bay. Now, of course, if you go farther south and a little earlier, 1607, Jamestown, religion doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with the colony. They were there to strike it rich and make money. You know, and religion took a backseat to economic interests. Or what if you define nation, or when the nation being founded in, say, 1776 or 1789 with the Constitution, the ratification of the ratification of the Constitution, or maybe the nation, if you define nation as the way people feel towards each other as being part of something big, a nation, it could have even come later. So, for example, if you were walking down the streets in Philadelphia in 1800 and you said to someone, you know, who are you? What is your identity? What is your political identity? They would probably not say, I am a member of the United States of America, or I'm a citizen of the U.S. They would say, I'm a Pennsylvanian, or I'm a Virginian. You know, who's the Southern the reenactor here, right? You know this, right? You know, I'm from an individual state rather than necessarily a nation. It's really not till after the Civil War in many ways that especially people in the South start thinking for the first time that we're part of a unified nation rather than I'm a South Carolinian, or right, I'm from Texas, or you know, something like that. So depending on how you define your terms, you might come up with a different answer to the question in the title of the book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? So let's get into some of the details here, some of the couple points just that I want to make in the time that we have here. The book really has three parts to it. The first part, I sort of trace this idea of America as a Christian nation from 1800 all the way up to the present. In the second part of the book, I get into the Revolution, and the Founding Fathers. Couple things. One, the Bible was used very, very often by the Founding Fathers and by ministers in the era. I have a whole chapter on the way ministers from the 18th century used the Bible. And they used it constantly. They used their pulpits to preach the revolution. They would get up in their pulpits and say, you know, God is on our side. We need to support this revolution. Again, I'm not particularly interested whether or not that was good or bad or right or wrong. It's just what they did. That's what the historical record shows. Now, what's interesting about this is, let's take these ministers, for example. Like, say, John Witherspoon, the president of the College of New Jersey at Princeton. Which today is Princeton University, who was an evangelical Presbyterian minister, only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence, right? He's producing out of Princeton all of these pro-patriot pastors who go in, I say that 3 times fast, who go into these communities in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and so forth and start pastoring these churches that support the revolution. There's one of his graduates, his name is Enoch Green. And Enoch Green is the pastor of the Deerfield Presbyterian Church in Cumberland County, New Jersey. Enoch Green, in 1769, preaches a sermon from the book of Galatians in the New Testament, chapter 5 and verse 1. And in that verse it says, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says something to the effect of, we are no longer slaves to sin, but we have been set free from a yoke of slavery by Jesus Christ. And he preaches this sermon much like any Christian, for the past 1,000 years would have preached that passage. He says, we're sinful, like any Christians believe we're sinful. We thus need to be free. We need to turn to God to be free from our sins, and the slavery that's holding us down is the sin nature, the devil, or something like that. 6 years later, Enoch Green preaches from the exact same passage, 1775 now. And I read both the manuscript sermons. They're in the special collections at Rutgers University if you want to go look at them yourself. In 1775, he preaches from the same text, and we know that because Presbyterian ministers wrote the text on top of their sermons. These were notes that I was reading. And in that sermon, the interpretation of the passage has completely changed from 6 years ago. Now, the enslaver is not the devil or sin, but it's George III. The freedom is not freedom in Christ, but it's freedom from Parliament. And the great freer is not Jesus Christ, but the Continental Army. So when I say that the Bible was very important to these people, many of these people depart from the ways in which the Bible, certain passages have been interpreted for generations and generations and generations in order to make the Bible fit with the political times of the day. So again, you can debate whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but for the last 1,000 years before Enoch Green preached this sermon, no one equated slavery with George III. Or no one talked about freedom in terms of political freedom. They talked about Christian freedom, or freedom in Christ, as they would have said. So that's the first point I try to make in this book. The Bible was very important to the revolutionaries and to those who were patriots, but they also used it in very sort of different ways than historically the passages were used. Second point, let's take the documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Let's take just for the sake of time, let's take the Constitution. Now, in 2008, and I don't mean to be political here, I'm just making stating this fact. In 2008, John McCain, when he was running for president, made a statement in which he said, "The United States Constitution teaches that we were founded as a Christian nation," and just sort of left it at that. Now, if you read the Constitution carefully, there's one reference to God in the Constitution, and that is right at the beginning. It says, "In the year of our Lord, 1787," which was simply the way of saying what the date was. Other than that, there's no references to the Christian God, or any God for that matter, in the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution specifically says that there will be no establishment of religion. There will be no state church. The government will not fund a particular denomination or religion. And then, of course, we probably all know the First Amendment, in which it says there's we have freedom of religion, or freedom to practice religion without government intrusion. So at first glance, it looks like the Constitution is a fairly secular document, and in the book I argue it pretty much is. There's nothing Christian about the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that establishes a Christian nation. It clearly says that there's freedom of religion and everybody has the right to practice religion the way they want. Now, compare that, however, to all 13, or 12, I should say, the 13 states. Each one of those states write their own constitution after the American Revolution. Now, if you look at those are deeply, deeply Christian in nature. Especially, they allow religious freedom. You can worship any way you want. But the founders of those constitutions have embedded within them qualifications for office holding that are really Christian. So, for example, let's take Pennsylvania, for example. 1776 Constitution says if you want to serve in government in Pennsylvania, you have to uphold the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testaments. You have to be a Protestant. And you have to uphold the Trinity. Or else you can't serve. Catholics then can't be in government in Pennsylvania in 1776. Jews, atheists. You need to be a Protestant. You have to uphold the inspiration of the divine Old and New Testament. My favorite one, and I say this as a historian, not any another way, because it's so interesting, the change over time. Vermont. Today we think of Vermont as this sort of bastion of kind of secular liberalism, first state to endorse gay marriage, Howard Dean, very small percentage of Christians in Vermont. If you look at their 1776 Constitution, now they don't become a state until 1791, but in 1776 they're an independent state. Same stuff. You have to uphold the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament. You have to keep the Sabbath. How they check that, I don't know. With all these qualifications. The only one that doesn't have any qualifications is Virginia. And that's because Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought very diligently against Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry wanted Virginia to be a Christian state and there be a Christian establishment. In other words, your tax money would go to support Christian ministers, whether you were a Christian or not. That's what a church establishment means. Patrick Henry wanted that. Jefferson and Madison said, no way. We want to keep religion completely separate and out of government. And they won. And what's really interesting, you know why they won? There are a bunch of Baptists in Virginia. who believed that the separation of church and state was important because historically Baptists had always been persecuted by established churches. And they fought and said, we need to keep religion a private matter. Government should not be supporting of religion, because when government supports religion, like the Anglican Church did in Virginia, we're going to be the ones that are going to be persecuted, because we're not going to be the established church. So these strange bedfellows, Jefferson, who's largely a skeptic, not a Christian by sort of traditional definition of the term, in terms of his belief system, and all these sort of born-again Baptists unite together to create a colony in Virginia, a state now in Virginia, that has complete separation of church and state and no qualifications for office. You know, see what I mean by strange bedfellows here? They're fighting for the same purpose. And theologically, they're completely different. So Virginia's the only one. All the other 12 states have qualifications for office. So now, let's get back to the first question I asked. How do we define nation? Well, if we define it in terms of what the Constitution says, it's clearly not a Christian nation. There's nothing about that, nothing in the Constitution to support this idea. So if the nation's the Constitution, you would say no. If the nation is made up of the individual states, then it gets a lot more complicated. And in the 1780s, does anyone know what the government was in America and for most of the 1780s?
Articles of Confederation.
Or Confederation.
Yeah, the Articles of Confederation, which give all the power to the states and little power to the central government. So, you know, if you wanted to say the nation began in 1776, there is this period in which the states are calling the shots, and they all have these qualifications for office. So again, this is why when we take a modern question, was America founded as a Christian nation, and try to bring history to bear on that, we need to be careful. We need to do it in a nuanced way, because history is not that simple where we can just say yes or no to these questions. Final point I'll make, and then I'm sure there'll be multiple questions. Everywhere I go, people want to ask questions. You can attack me, you can support me, you can, I'll just, fire away here in a second. The last point I want to make is about the Founding Fathers and their religious beliefs. There is a certain sort of lack of logic sometimes from people when they say, if you're a Christian, then you must support a Christian nation. If you're not a Christian, then logically you're against the Christian nation. The example I just gave of the Baptists totally defeats that idea. These people were the most devout, sort of born-again, we call them born-again Christians today. And they did not want a Christian nation. So just because you believe in Christianity doesn't necessarily mean you want the nation to be Christian. But the Founding Fathers, I always tell this to my students, do not, when it comes to religion, do not say the Founding Fathers were all Christians, or the Founding Fathers were all deists, or they were something else. Because each individual Founding Father had a very different perspective on religion and its relationship to American society and government. So, for example, you have Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who were very, very skeptical of religion. Neither of them, we could say, were Christians. Although Jefferson claimed he was a Christian simply because he was born in the Anglican Church and baptized. But here's a guy who didn't believe in classic Christian doctrines. He didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He didn't believe in the divine inspiration of the Bible or anything like that. Jefferson, Franklin, very much skeptical. They believed in God, but they didn't believe that God sort of incarnated himself in the world and died for the sins of the world, rose on the third day, and so forth. There are no atheists, in other words, among the Founding Fathers. But very few of them, or I should say, some of them, were not necessarily Orthodox Christians either. George Washington, who we were talking about before, is very difficult to figure out. Here's a guy who was born in the Anglican Church, was a vestryman in his congregation, meaning he was one of the leaders of his church, but he never talked about religion, never wrote about it hardly in his works, in his writings. I think mentions the word Jesus Christ once in all of his writings. Remember, Washington is not a I think he'd be shocked to learn that we're sitting around here today in our culture talking about whether or not he was a Christian or not. Washington was a statesman, he was a military general, his job was to lead the Continental Army, his job was to help build a republic. And that's what he focused on. In his private writings, in his letters to people, in his public statements, he constantly talked, he rarely talked about sort of religion. Then I have a chapter in the book about those who were clearly Christians. John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, Sam Adams, John Witherspoon, who I mentioned, the president of the College of New Jersey. I could have added Patrick Henry to that group. So again, their beliefs are very diverse in that regard. What they all did believe, however, were two things, and then I'll stop. They all believed in something that was called, in the 18th century, providence. Providence was the belief that God was in control of the world and sometimes would be actively engaged in the world. Maybe God would even come in and perform a miracle every now and then because he was providential. They all believed in that, almost across the board. A great example of this is Ben Franklin. Someone before was mentioning about change over time, how people change their views, through time. If you read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, he says at the beginning that he was reading these tracts written by deists. Now, for those of you who don't know, a deist is someone who believes that God created the world and then just let it go, let it run by natural laws, laws of science, laws of politics, and so forth. Never intervenes, doesn't perform miracles, doesn't answer prayer or raise people from the dead or anything like that. When Franklin's a teenager, he's actually reading these deist tracts he talks about in his autobiography, and he's reading them to try to show that the deists were wrong. He's reading the enemy, so to speak. When he reads them, he comes completely convinced that the deists are actually right and Christianity's wrong. So he claims he's become a thoroughgoing deist. But then at the end of his life, he certainly never becomes a Christian, but he actually begins to see a God who's much more active. And let me give you an example of this. He's in his 70s, Franklin. He's at the Constitutional Convention. It's July 1787. It's hot. They have the window shut because they want to keep quiet, secret, and they're arguing. Now, some of you remember this from your civics class. They're arguing about representation in the House of Representatives. You have the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan. Does anyone remember this stuff? The Connecticut Compromise. They're debating this. I'm not going to go into all the details about that. And things are getting very, very heated, both literally and figuratively. Of all people, Benjamin Franklin stands up and says, we need to call for prayer here. We need to pray to solve the differences. I say of all people because Franklin, again, has always been a very skeptical person when it comes to religion. And there's also a story that goes, well, he gives this proposal. The proposal's rejected by the members of the committee. There's a story that's probably not true, but it's worth telling. It's one like the cherry tree story. There's this story that Alexander Hamilton stood up and said, we must reject Franklin's proposal because the United States of America will not be reliant upon any foreign power. So we can't pray because that's appealing to a foreign power. I don't think that's true, but that's a story that was popular in the 19th century. Anyway, what's interesting about this, the reason why they reject the proposal, is not because they don't want prayer. They don't think prayer is a good idea. It's actually because they're so poor. They don't have any money to support themselves. They can't afford to hire. There's nothing in the budget available there to hire a minister to come in every day. So that's why they reject it if you read the minutes of the Constitutional Convention enough. So they clearly had this belief in providence. In other words, the Founding Fathers, you'd be hard-pressed to call them deists, because deism implies God is not active. A deist doesn't ask for prayer, I guess is my point. And that's one of the distinctions I make. The second thing that all the Founding Fathers affirmed, whether they believed in Christianity or not, all the Founding Fathers believed that religion, and particularly Christianity, which was the dominant religion of the day, was actually good for the American Republic. Because religion taught people how to be virtuous, taught people to think about things outside of their own interests and think of the common good. Now, how do they know this? Because they took History 101 in college. They studied republics. They studied the Roman Republic. They saw how people were so self-interested that the republic crumbled and degenerated into an empire in which nobody had, strong rights. They did not want that to happen to America, so they wanted a virtuous republic. They wanted to train people how to sacrifice their own interests for the good of the nation. And they thought, hey, the best people that can do this are religious people. because they know how to sacrifice their own interests for God or for something greater than themselves. So all of them believed that religion was important to the Republic and needed to be promoted in one way or another, whether it be through the government or whether it be through local churches or so forth. They encouraged religion and that doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to be a uniquely Christian nation. Benjamin Rush, for example, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, actually wrote this essay on religion and education. And he said, we need to teach religion in the public schools. Sound familiar, right? We need to teach religion in the public schools. We need to teach religion because it will teach young men and women, even women, to be good Republican machines, right? People who are willing to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. And I don't care whether that religion is the religion of Confucius, of Muhammad, or Christianity. Although at the end he says, Christianity's the best, he said, but I don't care. As long as that religion is teaching people to be virtuous and supporting the country, then I'm in support of it and it should be taught. So these are just some of the things that I unpack in the book. Again, I talk about the relationship between Christianity and the American Revolution, the relationship between the Founding Fathers and religion. And then at the beginning of the book, I sort of trace this idea, who are the people running around saying that we're a Christian nation and not a Christian nation today, just to give some sort of background to all of that. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention, and we do have time for some questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's take some questions, and that might be a way to flesh out some more of the things that I've written about in the book.
Something